Thomas Pike was already leaning too far over the stone edge when his sister found him. The 8-year-old boy had his small hands gripping the weathered rocks. His body stretched forward like he was trying to touch something in the black water below. Mercy grabbed his shirt and yanked him backward so hard they both tumbled into the tall grass. "What are you doing, you little fool?" Mercy wiped dirt from her knees and glared at her 6-year-old brother. The abandoned Hartwell place had been off limits since before she could remember, but Thomas never listened to rules that didn't come with immediate consequences. "There's something down there." Thomas pointed toward the well with a trembling finger. "Something moving." Mercy looked at the old stone structure. It had been here longer than anyone in town, built back when the Hartwells still mattered, before they lost everything and left their property to rot. The wooden cover had rotted away years ago, leaving just a dark circle that seemed to swallow sunlight. "Ain't nothing down there but water and rocks." But even as she said it, Mercy felt something cold crawl up her spine. The morning air had gone still, like the world was holding its breath. "Look." Thomas crawled back toward the edge. "Look and tell me I'm lying." Against every instinct screaming in her head, Mercy approached the well. The stones were green with moss and slick with morning dew. She peered over the edge and saw her own reflection staring back from the dark water 15 feet below. Then the reflection shifted, and she saw what Thomas had been pointing at. A baby, pale and still, floating just beneath the surface. Its tiny arms spread wide, its face turned toward the sky they couldn't see. The water was so clear she could make out every detail, from the delicate fingers to the white gown that billowed around the small body like angel wings. "Jesus Christ!" The words escaped before Mercy could stop them. Her mother would have washed her mouth with soap, but no amount of punishment could take back what she was seeing. "I told you," Thomas pressed against her shoulder, both children now staring into the water. "Is it dead?" "Course it's dead. Babies don't float." But Mercy's voice shook. Something about the scene felt wrong beyond the obvious horror. The baby looked too perfect, too peaceful, like it was sleeping instead of drowned. "We got to tell Daddy." Mercy grabbed Thomas by the wrist and pulled him away from the well. "We got to tell him right now." They ran through the tall grass toward their house, stumbling over hidden roots and rocks. Mercy's chest burned, but she didn't slow down. Behind them, the Hartwell place seemed to watch with empty windows, like dead eyes in a skull. Sheriff Pike was cleaning his service revolver on the kitchen table when his children burst through the screen door. Coffee steamed in his cup, and the morning paper lay folded beside his elbow. He looked up with the patient expression of a man accustomed to childhood emergencies that turned out to be nothing. "Daddy, there's a baby in the well." Mercy's words tumbled out in a rush. "A dead baby, floating in the water." Sheriff Pike set down his cleaning rag. His weathered face didn't change expression, but something shifted behind his eyes. "What well?" "The old one, behind the Hartwell place." Thomas had caught his breath now, and his voice came out stronger. "It's floating face up, wearing a white dress." Their father stood slowly, like his joints hurt. He walked to the window and looked out toward the abandoned property, though the well wasn't visible from their kitchen. When he turned back, his face had gone pale under his tan. "You children stay here. Don't move from this house." "But Daddy," Mercy started. "I said stay here." Sheriff Pike's voice carried the authority that had kept their town quiet for 20 years. "I'll be back directly." He gathered rope from the shed and a battery-powered lantern from the closet. Mercy and Thomas watched through the kitchen window as their father walked across the field toward the Hartwell place, his stride quick but careful, like a man approaching something dangerous. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Pike returned with something wrapped in an old blanket. His face was grim, and his hands shook as he set the bundle on the kitchen counter. Thomas reached for it, but their father caught his wrist. "Don't touch it." Sheriff Pike unwrapped the blanket to reveal a wooden doll carved from pale wood and dressed in rotting white cloth. The fabric had once been delicate, maybe even beautiful, but now it was stained with algae and time. The doll's face was smooth and featureless, but somehow still managed to look peaceful. "That ain't what we saw." Thomas stepped back from the counter. "There was a real baby down there." Sheriff Pike turned the doll over in his hands, and Mercy saw his face go white as fresh snow. Carved into the back, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them, were 2 letters, E.H. Daddy? Mercy watched her father's hands tremble. What's wrong? Sheriff Pike wrapped the doll back in the blanket with movements that seemed automatic, like he was sleepwalking. When he looked at his children, his eyes held something Mercy had never seen before. Fear. Real, deep fear that went bone deep. You listen to me, both of you. His voice was quiet, but harder than steel. You never saw anything in that well. You never found this doll. You never went to the Hartwell place. Daddy, Thomas ain't lying, Mercy started. I said never. Not to your mama, not to nobody. But what if? There ain't no what if. That doll's been down there 20 years. Ain't nothing else. Sheriff Pike walked to the kitchen door and looked back at his children. Some things stay buried for good reason. This is one of them. You forget what you saw today. You hear me? You forget it, and you never speak of it again. The screen door slammed behind him, leaving Mercy and Thomas alone in the kitchen with the echo of their father's fear hanging in the air like smoke. Sheriff Pike sat alone on his porch as the sun disappeared behind the hills, the carved doll resting in his lap like a sleeping child. His wife had taken the children to her sister's house for the night. Sensing something dark had settled over her husband like a storm cloud, the silence pressed against him, heavy with the weight of 20 years. The initials carved into the doll's back seemed to burn through the wood into his fingers. E.H. Elena Hartwell. Except that wasn't her real name, and Pike knew it better than anyone. The memory came back like blood seeping through bandages, no matter how many layers he wrapped around it. 20 years ago, when his hair was still brown and his hands didn't shake when he poured coffee, when he wore a deputy's badge and thought the worst thing a man could do was look the other way. The mule traders had arrived on a Tuesday in late September, their wagon train kicking up dust clouds that could be seen for miles. Pike remembered standing on this same porch, watching them approach with the curiosity of a young man who'd never seen much beyond the town limits. The lead wagon carried an old man with sun-weathered skin and eyes like flint, and beside him sat a girl who looked like she'd been carved from the same hard stone. Elena Morrison, 17 years old and pregnant as a rain cloud, her belly round under a faded blue dress. Her father had introduced her to Judge Hartwell and the town council with the weary resignation of a man who'd traveled too many roads and seen too many towns just like this one. My daughter needs shelter for the night, the old mule trader had said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd made this same request in a dozen different places. Just one night, and we'll be moving on come morning. Judge Hartwell had looked at the girl with eyes that made Pike's stomach turn even then. The judge was 63 years old, with silver hair and hands that shook from too much whiskey, but his mind was sharp as a blade when it came to opportunity. Of course we can help, Judge Hartwell had said, his voice smooth as oil on water. But nothing in this world comes free, you understand. The girl can stay, but she'll need to provide services to the community. Pike had been standing behind the judge, young and stupid, and wearing his deputy badge like it meant something. He should have spoken up then, should have asked what kind of services an old man expected from a pregnant teenager, but he'd kept his mouth shut like a good little deputy, and the words had died in his throat. Elena's father had looked at his daughter for a long moment, something passing between them that Pike couldn't read. Finally, the girl had nodded. I'll stay, she'd said, her voice steady despite the fear Pike could see swimming in her dark eyes. But you promise me something. You promise to care for my baby when it comes. Of course, Judge Hartwell had smiled, and Pike remembered thinking even then that the expression looked like something a snake might wear. We'll take good care of both of you. The old mule trader had climbed back onto his wagon without saying goodbye to his daughter. Pike watched the caravan disappear into the distance, leaving Elena Morrison standing alone in the town square with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing inside her. They'd taken her to the Hartwell house that night. Pike had been ordered to stand guard outside to make sure she didn't try to run. He'd spent 8 hours listening to sounds that still woke him up in cold sweats, sounds that made him understand exactly what kind of services Judge Hartwell had in mind. Elena had given birth 3 days later, screaming through the night while the town doctor worked by lamplight. Pike had been in the kitchen, pretending to drink coffee while his hands shook so bad he could barely hold the cup. When it was over, they'd brought Elena the baby, a perfect little girl with dark hair and her mother's fierce eyes. Elena had kissed the infant once, whispered something Pike couldn't hear, and then handed her back to the doctor. "Take care of her," Elena had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You promised." By morning, Elena Morrison was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving nothing behind but blood-stained sheets and a wooden doll carved with her initials. Judge Hartwell had claimed she'd run off in the night, abandoning her responsibilities and her child. The baby had died exactly 1 week later. Sudden infant death, the doctor had called it, but Pike knew better. He'd seen the way Judge Hartwell looked at the crying child, seen the calculations running behind those cold eyes. A dead baby couldn't grow up to ask uncomfortable questions about her mother or her father. They'd buried the infant in an unmarked grave behind the courthouse. Judge Hartwell conducting a brief ceremony with only Pike and the doctor in attendance. No headstone, no flowers, no name carved in marble. Just a small wooden cross that rotted away within 2 years. "Should have stopped them," Pike whispered to the empty porch, his voice cracking like old leather. "Should have said something." The doll felt heavier in his hands now, weighted with guilt and regret, and 20 years of sleepless nights. He'd been a coward then, and he was still a coward now. Nothing had changed except the color of his hair and the depth of his shame. His fingers loosened, and the doll slipped from his lap. It struck the porch stones with a sound like breaking bones, splitting apart into pieces that scattered across the weathered wood. Pike stared at the fragments, seeing Elena's face in every splinter. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. Sheriff Pike was sweeping the broken pieces of the wooden doll into a dustpan when Sarah Hartwell knocked on his office door. The morning sun cut through the dirty windows, casting long shadows across the floor where 20 years of secrets had settled like dust. Pike looked up to see a young woman with her grandfather's sharp jaw and her grandmother's worried eyes. "Sheriff Pike." Sarah's voice carried the careful politeness of someone who'd been raised to respect authority, even when she didn't trust it. "I need to speak with you about something." Pike dumped the doll fragments into the trash can and set the dustpan aside. Sarah Hartwell was 25 years old, unmarried, and worked as a seamstress in the shop her grandmother had left her. She kept to herself mostly, which made her presence in his office unusual enough to raise alarms. "What can I do for you, Sarah?" "It's about the woman in my dreams." Sarah clutched a leather-bound book against her chest like armor. "She's been calling to me from the old well behind our place, calling for 3 nights straight." Pike felt his blood turn cold. "What woman?" "Elena Morrison, the mule trader's daughter." Sarah's eyes never left Pike's face, watching for the reaction she knew would come. "The one who left her baby behind 20 years ago." "I don't know what you're talking about." But Pike's voice cracked like dried wood, and they both heard it. "Don't lie to me, Sheriff. Not about this." Sarah set the leather journal on his desk with the weight of a gravestone. Granddaddy wrote it all down. Every lie. Pike stared at the journal like it might bite him. The leather was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the brass clasp was green with age. He'd seen Judge Hartwell writing in that book countless times, always late at night when he thought no one was watching. "Where did you get that?" "Found it in his desk after the funeral, hidden behind a secret drawer I didn't even know existed." Sarah opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. He documented everything, every dirty deal, every bribe, every crime the town council covered up. "Sarah, you shouldn't be reading that." "Why?" "Because it tells the truth." Sarah's voice rose, and Pike heard 25 years of carefully buried anger finally breaking free. "Because it explains why my grandfather drank himself to death? Why he used to scream in his sleep about babies crying." Pike reached for the journal, but Sarah pulled it back. "Elena Morrison wasn't just some pregnant girl looking for shelter," Sarah continued, her finger tracing the careful handwriting on the page. "She was 17 years old and had been assaulted by my Uncle William when the mule traders came through 6 months earlier." "That's enough." "The baby wasn't hers by choice, Sheriff. It was William's child, conceived through violence, and my grandfather knew it." Pike's hands began to shake. "You don't understand what you're reading." "I understand plenty." Sarah turned several pages, revealing column after column of dates, names, and amounts. "Elena wasn't asked to stay one night. She was forced to stay as a witness to murder. The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Pike felt his chest tighten, making it hard to breathe. What murder? The traveling preacher who came through town that same week. Preacher Jonathan Reed. Sarah read directly from the journal now, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. He'd been asking too many questions about federal money the town council had been skimming. Granddaddy and the others killed him, buried him in the woods behind Miller's Creek. You're making this up. They made Elena watch, made her help dig the grave so she'd be complicit, so she couldn't tell anyone without implicating herself. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. She was just a girl, Sheriff. A pregnant girl who'd already been through hell, and they made her dig a grave. Pike sat down heavily in his chair, feeling every one of his 58 years pressing down on his shoulders like stones. Why you bringing this to me now? Because Elena's coming back. I seen her in my dreams, walking across the desert with blood on her dress. People don't come back from the dead, Sarah. She ain't dead. She's been waiting. The words hit Pike like a physical blow. He'd assumed Elena Morrison had died years ago, probably in some distant city where nobody knew her name or her story. The idea that she might still be alive, that she might return, had never seriously crossed his mind. What makes you think she's alive? Because I seen her. Sarah closed the journal and held it against her chest again. 3 nights ago, she appeared at the foot of my bed. Looked exactly like she did 20 years ago, except for her eyes. Her eyes were older, sadder, but burning with something I ain't never seen before. That was just a dream. Was it? Then explain why I found this on my windowsill the next morning. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a carved wooden flower, identical in style to the doll Pike had found in the well. She left it for me, left it with a message. Pike's mouth went dry. What message? That the dead don't rest until the truth comes out. That some debts pass from generation to generation until somebody finally has the courage to pay them. Sarah, you need to forget about this. Burn that journal and forget everything you read. I can't do that. You can and you will. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Not this one. Sarah stood, clutching the journal tighter. Elena Morrison is coming back to collect what's owed to her. And when she does, everybody who stayed silent is going to answer for what they did. Pike watched her walk toward the door, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If Elena Morrison really was alive, if she really was returning, then 20 years of carefully maintained silence were about to crumble like old foundations. Sarah, she stopped with her hand on the doorknob. What else did she say in your dream? Sarah turned back, and Pike saw something in her expression that chilled him to the bone. Not fear, but anticipation. Like she was waiting for justice to finally arrive. She said to tell you that the baby's crying has kept her awake for 20 years, and now it's time for everybody else to lose some sleep. The door closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid, leaving Pike alone with the weight of the past and the terrible certainty that the future was about to catch up with him. Mercy Pike waited until her father left for his evening patrol before slipping out of the back door with Thomas in tow. The sun was already touching the horizon, painting the sky the color of dried blood. She knew disobeying her father's direct orders would earn her a switching, but something stronger than fear was pulling her back toward the Hartwell place. "Mama's gonna be mad," Thomas whispered as they crept through the tall grass behind their house. "Mama don't need to know." Mercy grabbed her brother's hand and pulled him toward the abandoned property. "We're just gonna look. Make sure there ain't nothing else down in that well." The Hartwell place looked different at sunset, more alive somehow, despite its decay. Shadows stretched long across the yard, and the broken windows seemed to watch them approach like empty eye sockets. Mercy felt her skin prickle with the same sensation she'd had that morning, like invisible fingers trailing across her neck. They were 50 yards from the well when Thomas stopped walking. "There's somebody there." Mercy squinted through the fading light and saw what her brother had spotted first. A figure sat on the stone edge of the well, perfectly still. Like a statue, someone had forgotten to move. As they got closer, Mercy could make out more details that made her stomach clench with fear and fascination. It was a woman, maybe 37 or 40 years old, with gray-streaked hair that hung loose around her shoulders. She wore a dress that might have been white once but was now stained with rust-colored patches that looked suspiciously like old blood. Her feet were bare, and her hands rested calmly in her lap as she stared down into the dark water. "Should we run?" Thomas whispered. Before Mercy could answer, the woman looked up. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with the kind of hardship that aged people beyond their years. But her eyes were sharp and alive, burning with an intensity that made Mercy think of banked coals ready to burst into flame. "You're Pike's girl." The woman's voice carried across the distance between them, not loud, but somehow reaching them clearly despite the evening breeze. Mercy felt her feet moving forward without conscious decision, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Yes, ma'am." "What's your name, child?" "Mercy. And this is Thomas." The woman nodded as if she'd expected this answer. Fitting names for what's coming. "You can call me Elena." Thomas pressed closer to his sister, his small hand gripping her wrist tight enough to leave marks. "Are you the lady who left the baby?" Elena's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes like lightning in a storm cloud. "I am." "Where you been all this time?" Mercy found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "Waiting." Elena stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Waiting in the desert, learning things, becoming something new, becoming something strong enough to come back and set things right. "What things?" "Your daddy was there that night. He's seen what they did." Thomas tugged on Mercy's sleeve. "What did they do?" Elna walked closer, her bare feet making no sound on the dead grass. In the dying light, the bloodstains on her dress looked fresh, as if they'd never dried. "They made me hold the shovel, made me complicit in their sins." "What shovel?" Mercy asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. "The one we used to bury Preacher Reed, the man who came to town asking too many questions about missing federal money." Elena stopped 10 feet away from the children, close enough that they could see the lines of pain etched around her eyes. "Your granddaddy, Judge Hartwell, and his council of thieves killed that preacher, and they made a 17-year-old girl help them hide the body." "That's not true." But Thomas's voice wavered with uncertainty. "Child, I wish it wasn't. I wish a lot of things weren't true." Elna reached into a pocket hidden in the folds of her dress and pulled out a letter sealed with red wax. "But wishing don't change what happened. Don't change what needs to be done." Mercy stared at the letter, recognizing somehow that taking it would change everything, that her life would split into before and after this moment, like a tree struck by lightning. "What's in it?" "Justice. Long overdue, but better late than never." Elena held the letter out toward Mercy. "Give this to your father. Tell him the reckoning's come." "I don't understand." "You will, sooner than I'd like." "Probably." Elena's voice softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the scared girl she'd once been. "Your daddy made choices 20 years ago. Bad choices that he's been living with ever since. Now it's time for him to face what he helped create." Mercy reached out and took the letter. The wax seal was warm against her fingers, as if it had been sitting in sunlight instead of a dead woman's pocket. "Are you going to hurt him?" "That depends on him, on whether he finally decides to do the right thing." Elena turned back toward the well, her attention already moving beyond the children. Some men find courage when they're cornered. Others just find more creative ways to hide. "What about the baby?" "Your baby?" Elena's shoulders tensed, and for a moment she looked every one of her 37 years. "My baby's been waiting in the ground for 20 years with no name, no marker, no recognition that she ever existed. That changes now." "She?" "Sarah. I named her Sarah, after the woman in the Bible who waited so long for a child." Elena's voice broke slightly on the name. "She lived 6 days of crying that nobody answered because they were all too busy covering their tracks." Thomas stepped forward, his child's instinct for comfort overriding his fear. "I'm sorry your baby died." "Thank you, child. That means more than you know." Elna looked back at Mercy, and the girl saw something in those weathered features that reminded her of her own mother when she was trying to be strong about something that was breaking her heart. "Tell your father I came back for 2 things. To bury my daughter proper, with a headstone and flowers and all the love she should have had, and to collect what's owed to me." "What's owed?" 20 years of silence. 20 years of men sleeping peaceful in their beds, while a baby girl moldered in unmarked ground. Elena's voice hardened again, becoming something sharp enough to cut. "That debt's come due with interest." The woman turned and walked away into the gathering darkness, her blood-stained dress fluttering in the evening breeze like a flag of war. Sheriff Pike sat at his kitchen table with Elena's letter spread before him like a death warrant. The house was quiet except for the soft breathing of his wife sleeping upstairs and the tick of the old clock on the mantel. The red wax seal had broken cleanly, revealing pages of careful handwriting that made his blood run cold with every line. The letter began simply enough, but the words cut like a blade. "Sheriff Pike, you know who I am and you know what you did 20 years ago. You also know what you failed to do." Pike's hands trembled as he read, the paper rustling like dried leaves. Elena's handwriting was precise, controlled, each letter formed with the patience of someone who'd had decades to plan exactly what they wanted to say. "I have been watching this town for 8 months. I know about the federal highway money that disappeared into private accounts. I know about the evidence that gets lost when certain families are involved. I know about the girls who go missing when they ask too many questions." Pike's stomach clenched. Elena had been here for months, invisible, documenting everything. The thought of being watched without knowing it made his skin crawl. The letter continued with methodical precision. "You have 3 days to arrest the surviving members of the town council for the murder of preacher Jonathan Reed, Judge Hartwell, Banker Morton, Merchant Collins, and yourself. If you do not act within 72 hours, I will handle justice in my own way." Pike set the letter down and rubbed his eyes. Through the kitchen window, he could see the lights of town twinkling in the distance, each one representing families who trusted him to keep them safe. But safe from what? From a woman seeking justice for crimes that had been buried for 2 decades, or from the men who'd committed those crimes in the first place. He picked up the letter again. The final paragraph was the worst part. "I know you think I am just one woman against powerful men. You are wrong. I am no longer the scared girl you helped destroy 20 years ago. I have learned things in the desert, Sheriff. I have become something new, something that does not forgive, something that does not forget, and something that does not die easy." The letter was signed simply Elena Morrison, followed by a postscript that made Pike's hands shake harder. "P.S. Tell your children I enjoyed meeting them today. They have their mother's eyes and their grandfather's conscience. I hope they keep both." Pike stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. Elena had spoken to Mercy and Thomas. His children had been in contact with a woman who might be dangerous, might be insane, might be something worse than either. He walked to the stove and turned on the gas burner, watching the blue flame dance in the darkness. The letter caught fire easily, the pages curling and blackening as Elena's words disappeared into smoke. But even as the physical evidence burned, Pike knew the ultimatum remained. 3 days, 72 hours to decide between destroying his career and facing whatever Elena Morrison had become during her 20 years in the wilderness. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Pike glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Nobody came calling at this hour unless something was seriously wrong. He opened the door to find Deputy Jackson Gray standing on his porch, hat in hand, face pale in the moonlight. "Sheriff, we got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Judge Hartwell's dead." Pike felt the world tilt slightly. "What happened?" "Doc says his heart just stopped. Natural causes, far as we can tell." Gray shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "Found him in his study about an hour ago. Door was locked from the inside. No signs of violence." "Who found him?" "His housekeeper. She heard him screaming around 11 o'clock, but when she tried to get in, the door wouldn't budge. Took her 20 minutes to find another key." Pike stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "Screaming about what?" "That's the strange part. She said it sounded like he was pleading with somebody, but there wasn't nobody else in the room." Gray lowered his voice. "Sheriff, there's something else. Something you need to see." "What?" "He was holding something when we found him, something that don't make much sense." Pike followed his deputy to the patrol car parked in his driveway. Gray opened the trunk and pulled out an evidence bag containing what looked like a small piece of white fabric. Even through the plastic, Pike could see the dark stains that covered most of the material. "What is it?" "Baby's dress. Little white thing. Covered in blood." Gray held the bag up to catch the moonlight. "Doc says the blood's old, maybe 20 years or more. but Sheriff Judge Hartwell was clutching it like his life depended on it. Pike stared at the tiny dress, his mind racing. Elena's letter, her ultimatum, and now Judge Hartwell was dead, apparently scared to death while holding evidence of a crime from 2 decades ago. Doc find anything else? Letter on his desk, burned to ash, but you could still make out parts of it. Gray reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper with writing that had been partially reconstructed. Looks like somebody was making demands. Pike could make out fragments of Elena's handwriting, the same precise script he'd just burned in his kitchen. The words justice and reckoning were clearly visible, along with what looked like part of an ultimatum. Bag it. Don't let nobody else see. Yes, sir. Gray put the evidence back in the trunk. Sheriff, what you think this is about? Pike looked toward the Hartwell place, its dark windows visible in the distance. Judge Hartwell had been the leader of the town council, the man who'd orchestrated Elena's captivity and the preacher's murder. Now he was dead, apparently frightened to death by nothing more than a letter in a blood-stained baby dress. I think somebody's come back to settle old debts. What kind of debts? Pike thought about Elena's transformation, about the woman who'd spent 20 years in the desert, learning to become something that fed on guilt and fear. Judge Hartwell had been carrying the weight of his crimes for 2 decades, and that guilt had apparently been enough to kill him when confronted with evidence of what he'd done. The kind that don't age well. Pike headed back toward his house. Double the patrols tonight. And Gray? Yes. Sir? If anybody else gets a letter in the next few days, I want to know about it immediately. What kind of letter? You'll know it when you see it. Pike watched his deputy drive away, then stood in his driveway, staring up at the stars. Elena Morrison wasn't just seeking justice. She'd become something else entirely during her years in the wilderness, something that could kill with fear alone, that could make grown men's hearts stop with nothing but guilt and terror. 1 down, 3 to go. The first call came at dawn on the second day. Sheriff Pike was still drinking his morning coffee when Deputy Gray's voice crackled through the radio, high-pitched with panic. Sheriff, you need to get down to Morton's place right now. Pike set down his cup and grabbed his hat. What's the situation? Banker Morton's dead, drowned in his own well. How deep is that well? That's the problem, Sheriff. There's maybe 3 inches of water in the whole thing. Pike drove through the empty streets with his siren off, not wanting to wake the whole town to witness whatever fresh horror awaited him. Morton's house sat on 2 acres outside the town limits, a white colonial with green shutters that had always looked too fancy for a small-town banker. The well was behind the house, a decorative stone structure that Morton's wife had insisted on for their garden. Deputy Gray was standing beside the well when Pike arrived, his face pale as milk. Doc's already been here. Says Morton's been dead about 4 hours. Pike looked down into the shallow water and saw Banker Morton floating face down, his arms spread wide like he was trying to embrace the bottom of the well. The water barely covered his back. Man can't drown in 3 inches of water. That's what I said. But look at this. Gray pointed to the stone edge where a small wooden toy sat in the morning sunlight. It was a carved horse. The kind a child might play with, but stained dark with something that looked like dried blood. You touch it? Hell no! But Sheriff, that ain't all. Gray led Pike around to the other side of the well. Morton's wife found this pinned to their front door. Pike read the note written in Elena's careful handwriting. Banker Morton stole money meant for orphanages and schools. He knew where that money went when Preacher Reed came asking questions. He helped kill a man of God to protect his theft. Now he knows what it feels like to drown in his own greed. Sheriff, what in God's name is happening? Pike folded the note and put it in his pocket. God ain't got nothing to do with this. This is older justice. The second call came 18 hours later. Pike was eating dinner with his family when the phone rang, and he knew before answering that another council member was dead. Collins is gone, Gray said without preamble. Found him in his store about an hour ago. How? Hanged himself. But Sheriff, the rope's tied in a noose I ain't never seen before. Complex knots like sailors work. Collins never spent a day on water in his life. Pike looked at his wife and children sitting around the dinner table, their faces worried but still innocent of the darkness spreading through their town. I'll be there in 10 minutes. There's something else. Collins was holding a baby's shoe when we cut him down. Little white thing. Same style as that dress Judge Hartwell had. Collins' general store occupied the corner of Main Street and had been in his family for 3 generations. Pike found his deputy standing outside the locked front door, unwilling to go back inside. "Where is he?" "Back office. Door was locked from inside, but we broke it down when his wife couldn't raise him for supper." Pike walked through the store, past shelves lined with canned goods and farming supplies. The back office was small and cramped, barely big enough for Collins's desk and filing cabinet. The merchant hung from a beam in the ceiling, his face purple and swollen, a baby's white shoe clutched in his right hand. "Cut him down yet?" "Waiting for you to see first." "Sheriff, look at that rope work." Pike examined the noose around Collins's neck. The knots were intricate, professional, the kind of work that took years to master. Collins had been a simple shopkeeper who'd never traveled further than the county seat. No way he tied this himself. That's what I'm thinking. But the door was locked from inside, windows too. No other way in or out. Pike found the note tucked into Collins' shirt pocket. Merchant Collins sold spoiled food to poor families while hoarding the good supplies for paying customers. When Preacher Reed tried to help those families, Collins helped silence him forever. Now he swings like the man he helped murder. This is the same person writing these notes? Same handwriting, same paper. Pike stared at the impossibly complex knots. "But she ain't doing this directly." "What you mean?" "These men are killing themselves. Their guilt's so heavy it's driving them insane." Pike walked around Collins' body, studying the scene. "She's just the trigger, the sight of her, the memory of what they did. It's breaking their minds." "You saying she's some kind of witch?" "I'm saying she's become something these men can't face. Their consciences have been buried so long, when they finally surface, the shock kills them." Pike left Gray to handle the body and drove back to the sheriff's office. He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to protect his family from whatever Elena Morrison had become. But when he unlocked the front door, he found the lights already on. Elena sat in the jail cell like she'd been waiting for hours. The cell door was closed and locked, the keys hanging on their hook by Pike's desk where he'd left them. "How did you get in here?" "Same way I got into Morton's well. Same way I got into Collins' store." Elena's voice was calm, conversational, like they were discussing the weather. "Guilt opens a lot of doors, Sheriff." "You killed them." "I never laid a hand on either man. Didn't have to." Elena stood and walked to the cell bars. 20 years of buried conscience will eat a man alive when it finally surfaces. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing I wanted from them. Justice for Preacher Reed. Justice for my baby girl." Elena gripped the bars with hands that looked too strong for her size. "You got 1 day left, Sheriff. 1 day to do the right thing." "And if I don't?" Elena smiled, and Pike saw something in her eyes that made his blood turn cold. Not anger or hatred, but something far worse. Patience. The kind of patience that came from waiting 20 years for the perfect moment to strike. "Then we'll find out if you're stronger than your guilt." Sheriff Pike pulled a chair close to the jail cell and sat down heavily. Elena remained standing, her hands gripping the bars like she was the one keeping him locked out instead of herself locked in. The overhead light cast shadows between them, making her weathered face look even older than her 37 years. "You ready to hear the truth, Sheriff?" "I reckon I better be." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring past Pike toward the window that showed the dark street outside. When she spoke, her voice was steady but hollow, like she was reciting something she'd practiced in her mind 1,000 times. That baby wasn't Judge Hartwell's son's child. Pike felt his stomach drop. Then whose was it? "Preacher Jonathan Reed's, the man your town council murdered." Elena's fingers tightened on the bars. "He was my lover, the father of my child, and they made me watch while they killed him." "Elena, that don't make sense. You were 17. He was a grown man of God. He was 22 years old and the kindest soul I ever met." Elena's eyes focused on Pike with sharp intensity. "When the mule traders came through 6 months before that last trip, Jonathan was traveling with us. Said he had a calling to minister to folks who lived too far from churches." Pike tried to reconcile this new information with what he thought he knew. "Judge Hartwell said you were carrying William's child." "Judge Hartwell lied about everything. William Hartwell never touched me. But Jonathan and I, we fell in love on that first journey. I was young and stupid and thought love could protect us from the world. What happened when you came back? Jonathan had been preaching in small towns for months, asking questions about federal money that was supposed to help poor communities. Money that was disappearing into private accounts. Elena's voice hardened. When we arrived here, he already suspected your town council was stealing. Pike remembered the night clearly now. The way Judge Hartwell and the others had whispered in corners, the tension that had filled the air like smoke from a fire nobody could see. He confronted them. He had evidence, letters, bank records, testimony from people in other towns who'd been cheated. Elena moved closer to the bars. Judge Hartwell invited him to dinner to discuss it privately. Said they could work something out. And you went with him. I was pregnant and scared and in love with a man who thought the best of everyone. Elena's laugh was bitter. Jonathan believed they wanted to make things right. I knew better, but I was 17, and he wouldn't listen. Pike closed his eyes, imagining the scene. A young preacher full of righteous purpose, a pregnant girl who could see danger he couldn't, and a group of corrupt men who'd killed to protect their secrets. They poisoned his coffee. Slow acting made it look like his heart gave out. Elena's voice cracked for the first time. But they wanted him to know why he was dying, wanted him to understand that good men don't win against power. Jesus Christ. He died holding my hand, begging me to run. But there was nowhere to go. They had men watching every road out of town. Pike opened his eyes and saw tears running down Elena's face, the first sign of vulnerability she'd shown since appearing at the well. So, they kept you prisoner. 9 months, locked in the Hartwell house like a broodmare, waiting for the baby to come. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. They planned to use Jonathan's child as leverage against me. Keep me quiet by threatening to hurt the baby if I ever told anyone what really happened. But you escaped. I gave birth, knowing they would kill both of us eventually. They couldn't risk leaving witnesses alive forever. Elena's voice grew stronger again, fueled by old anger. I loved that baby more than my own life, but I knew what kind of men they were. Why didn't you take it with you? Because I was 17 and bleeding and half dead. Because I thought maybe someone decent would step forward. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 20 years of regret and self-recrimination. Pike understood now why Elena had left the carved doll, why she'd kissed her baby once and disappeared into the night. You were trying to save her. I was trying to give her a chance. Any chance. Elena gripped the bars so hard her knuckles went white. I thought if I wasn't there, if they couldn't use me to control her, maybe some family would adopt her. Maybe she'd have a real life. Elena, I'm sorry. Sorry, don't raise the dead. Pike stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where ordinary people slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that their sheriff was confronting 20 years of buried truth. What happened after you left? I walked into the desert and nearly died, spent 3 days drinking my own piss and eating cactus fruit before some prospectors found me. Elena's voice became distant, like she was remembering someone else's life. Took me 2 years to get strong enough to come back and check on my baby. You came back? Found her grave behind the courthouse. No name, no marker, just a pile of rocks that was already falling apart. Elena's voice turned cold as winter wind. Asked around town, real careful-like. Found out she died within a week of my leaving. The doctor said it was natural causes. The doctor was paid to say that, just like he was paid to say Jonathan died of heart failure. Elena released the bars and stepped back into the shadows of the cell. That's when I knew they'd never intended to let her live. They killed my baby just like they killed her father. Pike turned back to face her, seeing now the full scope of what had been done to this woman. Not just rape or assault, but the systematic destruction of everything she'd loved. So you spent 20 years learning how to make them pay. I spent 20 years becoming something strong enough to collect what they owed. Something that could make grown men's hearts stop with fear. Elena smiled, and Pike saw something ancient and terrible in her expression. Turns out guilt is a powerful weapon when you know how to use it. Elena reached through the jail cell bars and took the keys from the hook on the wall. The metal clinked softly as she unlocked the door and stepped out into the sheriff's office like she owned the place. Pike remained seated in his chair, watching her move with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to navigate the world without making unnecessary noise. You coming or not?" Pike stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting in the hard wooden chair. "Where we going?" "To finish what should have been finished 20 years ago." Elena walked toward the door, not bothering to check if he was following. "Time to face the last member of your council." "I was just a deputy then." "You were there. You saw." "You said nothing." Elena stopped with her hand on the doorknob. "That makes you complicit, as the rest of them." Pike followed her into the night air. The summer heat still oppressive even after midnight. Elena walked with purpose down Main Street toward the old cemetery behind the courthouse, her bare feet silent on the cracked pavement. Pike's boots echoed off the empty storefronts, the sound lonely in the darkness. "Elena, what exactly you planning to do?" "Give my daughter what she deserves, what she should have had from the beginning." The cemetery was older than the town itself, filled with weathered headstones and forgotten names from generations past. Elena led Pike through the maze of graves toward the back corner where the ground was bare and unmarked. She stopped beside a patch of earth that looked no different from any other, except for the slight depression that suggested something had been buried there long ago. "This is where they put her." No name, no marker, no acknowledgement that she ever existed. Elena's voice was quiet but edged with decades of pain, like she was trash they needed to dispose of. Pike stared at the unmarked grave, feeling the weight of his silence pressing down on him like a physical force. "Elena, I'm sorry." Sorry's a word people use when they want to feel better about themselves without actually doing anything. Elena reached into the shadows beside a nearby headstone and pulled out a shovel. "You want to make amends? Start digging." "What?" "You heard me. Dig her up." Elena held out the shovel, her eyes reflecting the pale moonlight like a cat's. "My baby's going to be buried proper, with her father, with a headstone that bears her name." Pike took the shovel with hands that trembled slightly. "Elena, disturbing a grave is what? Illegal? Immoral?" Elena's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "You worried about breaking the law now? After 20 years of covering up murder?" Pike positioned the shovel over the unmarked grave and pressed it into the earth. The soil was hard-packed and dry, but it gave way under pressure. As he dug, the rhythmic scraping of metal against dirt seemed to echo through the cemetery like a heartbeat. "You want to know the real sin? It wasn't that you were afraid. It's that you stayed comfortable." Pike paused in his digging, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the late hour. "I was 25 years old. I didn't have any power. You had a voice. You had a conscience. You had a choice." Elena sat on a nearby headstone, watching him work like a supervisor overseeing a punishment detail. "But you chose your career over doing what was right." "What you want me to do?" "I can't bring back the dead." "No, but you can stop letting them stay buried." Pike dug deeper, the hole growing wider and darker with each shovelful of earth. His shirt stuck to his back with perspiration, and his hands began to blister from gripping the wooden handle. "I was scared." "Of what? Losing your job? Having to find a new town to live in?" Elna's voice grew harder. "My baby was scared too. Scared and hungry and crying for someone to care about her. I didn't know they were going to kill her." "Yes, you did. Deep down, in the part of yourself you tried to ignore, you knew exactly what kind of men they were." Pike struck something solid with the shovel, not the hollow sound of wood, but the ring of metal against metal. He scraped away more dirt, revealing the corner of what looked like a steel box buried beneath, where the baby should have been. "That ain't a coffin." Elena stood and walked closer, peering into the hole. "No, it ain't." Pike cleared more earth away from the metal container. It was about the size of a large cigar box made of heavy steel that had resisted 20 years of burial. A simple latch held it closed, though rust had eaten away at the metal edges. "What is it?" "Open it and find out." Pike climbed out of the hole and pried the latch open with the tip of the shovel. The lid creaked as it swung back, revealing a collection of papers wrapped in oiled cloth. Even in the pale moonlight, Pike could see the careful handwriting that covered page after page of documents. Letters. Pike unwrapped the cloth carefully, afraid the papers might crumble at his touch. "These are letters. Preacher Reed's correspondence with federal investigators, everything he'd gathered about the missing money, the corruption, the lies." Elena's voice was steady now, businesslike. Judge Hartwell buried them with my baby, thinking nobody would ever look for them there." Pike read the first few lines of the top letter, his eyes widening as he recognized names and amounts that confirmed everything Elena had told him. Evidence of embezzlement, bribery, and conspiracy that went back years before Preacher Reed's murder. "This proves everything. Everything except where my baby's body actually is." Pike looked up from the letters to see Elena staring down at the empty hole. They moved her, burned her, scattered the ashes so there'd be nothing left to find. Elena's composure finally cracked, tears running down her weathered cheeks. "They took even that from me, even the chance to hold her bones." Pike carefully rewrapped the letters and climbed back into the hole. "Elena, I swear to you, I'll make this right. Will you? Or will you find another 20 years' worth of excuses?" Pike looked up at her from the bottom of the grave. Surrounded by earth and darkness and the weight of his own cowardice. "What do you want me to do?" "What you should have done 20 years ago. Tell the truth." The boarding house on Elm Street had seen better days, but Mrs. Henderson kept it clean and asked no questions about her guests. Elena Morrison sat in the small parlor every afternoon, reading newspapers and watching the town struggle with the truth that had finally surfaced like a body rising from deep water. 3 months had passed since Sheriff Pike arrested himself, and the federal investigators were still finding new evidence of corruption in every corner they looked. Mercy Pike knocked on the front door at exactly 4 o'clock, the same time she'd been coming for the past 6 weeks. Mrs. Henderson let her in with a knowing smile and pointed toward the parlor where Elena waited with 2 cups of tea and a plate of store-bought cookies. "Right on time. Mama says punctuality shows respect." Mercy sat in the chair across from Elena, her legs swinging because her feet didn't quite reach the floor. At 9 years old, she was all sharp angles and serious eyes like someone who'd grown up faster than she should have. "Your mama's a smart woman. How's she holding up?" "She cries when she thinks we ain't looking. But she says Daddy did the right thing. Finally." Mercy picked up her teacup with both hands, careful not to spill. "The federal men came by again yesterday, asked more questions about the old days." Elena nodded. The FBI had descended on the town like locusts after Pike turned over Preacher Reed's letters, and they'd been methodical in unraveling 20 years of carefully hidden crimes. Bank records, land deals, missing persons cases that had been closed too quickly. The corruption had been deeper and wider than even Elena had suspected. What kind of questions? About people who went missing. About money that disappeared. Mercy sipped her tea. Mama told them everything she knew, which wasn't much. Said she always suspected something was wrong, but never knew what. That's the curse of small towns. Everybody knows something's rotten, but nobody wants to be the one to say it out loud. Through the parlor window, Elena could see Main Street struggling to return to normal. Half the businesses had closed when their owners were arrested or fled town. The courthouse was crawling with federal agents, and 3 new judges had been appointed to clean up the mess. Sarah Hartwell had become something of a local hero, using her grandfather's estate to establish a foundation for missing women and children. "Sarah Hartwell came to see us last week," Mercy said, following Elena's gaze. "She's turning the old judge's house into a shelter. Says women who got nowhere else to go can stay there until they get back on their feet." "That's good. That house has seen enough suffering, time it was used for healing. She asked about you. Wanted to know if you were really leaving after Daddy's trial." Elena set down her teacup and studied Mercy's face. The girl had been coming here for weeks, listening to stories about justice and responsibility, about the price of silence and the weight of truth. Elena had been careful not to fill her with bitterness, but the child deserved to understand what had happened in her town. "Mama says you're leaving after the trial. This ain't my home anymore, but it could be yours, if you make it right." "How do I do that?" Elena reached into the small wooden box she kept on the table beside her chair. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was the carved doll that had started everything. She'd spent weeks repairing it, gluing the pieces back together with patient hands and steady resolve. By remembering, by speaking when others won't, by never letting silence win. Mercy looked at the doll with wide eyes. It was beautiful in its simplicity, carved from pale wood, and dressed in a tiny white gown that Elena had sewn herself. The initials EH were still visible on the back, but now they seemed like a blessing instead of a curse. This was in the well. This was all I had left of my daughter, all I could leave behind when I ran. Elena held the doll carefully, like it might break again. I carved it while I was pregnant, sitting in that house, waiting for her to be born. What was her name? Sarah. I named her Sarah. Mercy reached out and touched the doll's tiny face with one finger, like Sarah Hartwell. Different Sarah, but maybe that's fitting. Maybe one Sarah can honor another. Elena placed the doll in Mercy's hands. Some things need to be broken before they can be made whole. You want me to keep her? I want you to remember her. Remember that she lived, even if it was only for 6 days. Remember that she mattered. Elena's voice was steady, but Mercy could see the pain that still lived behind her eyes. And when you're older, when people try to bury new truths, I want you to think about what happens when good people stay quiet. Mercy cradled the doll against her chest. Are you really not coming back? This town doesn't need me anymore. It needs people like you and Sarah Hartwell, people who will build something better from what's left. But what if we mess it up? What if we make the same mistakes? Elena smiled for the first time since Mercy had known her, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her look younger than her 37 years. Then you'll learn from them and do better next time. That's what justice really is. Not punishment, but the promise to do better. Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer. Soon Mercy would have to go home to help her mother with dinner and homework and all the ordinary things that filled a child's life. But for now, she sat in the faded parlor holding a wooden doll that represented both an ending and a beginning. Elena? What, child? Thank you for making them tell the truth. Thank you for listening to it. Mercy stood and carefully tucked the doll inside her jacket. Will I ever see you again? When you need to. Justice has a long memory, and so do the women who carry it. Elena walked her to the door and watched as she headed down Elm Street toward home. Take care of that doll, Mercy Pike, and take care of this town. The girl turned back once to wave, then disappeared around the corner. Elena stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the sun set over a town that was finally learning to face its shadows. Tomorrow would bring another day of testimony, another chance for truth to surface and justice to be served. But tonight, Elena Morrison could rest, knowing that the next generation was already learning to speak when others wouldn't. The courthouse bells were ringing noon when Sheriff Pike was led away in handcuffs, sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy and accessory to murder. Elena Morrison stood on the courthouse steps watching the man who'd been silent for 20 years finally face the consequences of his cowardice. The crowd that had gathered was smaller than she'd expected, mostly federal agents and reporters from the big city papers who'd been covering the corruption scandal. Pike's wife and children weren't there. Elena had seen them loading suitcases into their car that morning, heading to stay with relatives in another state until the trial publicity died down. It was probably for the best. The children didn't need to see their father taken away in chains. Elena walked down Main Street one last time, noting the changes that 3 months of federal investigation had brought. Half the storefronts stood empty, their owners either arrested or fled. But new businesses were already moving in, run by people who had no connection to the old corruption. Sarah Hartwell's foundation occupied the former judge's house, its windows bright with fresh paint and hope. At the edge of town, Elena stopped at the cemetery where 2 new headstones stood side by side in the place of honor she'd demanded. The larger stone read, Preacher Jonathan Reed, beloved father and man of God. Born 1872, died 1895. He spoke truth to power. Beside it, a smaller stone bore the inscription Baby Sarah Morrison Reed, beloved daughter, born and died September 1895. Truth endures. Elena knelt beside the graves and placed her hand on the smaller headstone. The marble was smooth and warm from the morning sun, nothing like the cold earth where her daughter had lain unmarked for 20 years. It's finished, baby girl. They can't hurt you anymore. A shadow fell across the graves, and Elena looked up to see Mercy Pike standing nearby with a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. The 9-year-old girl had grown taller in the past months, but her eyes still held the same serious intelligence that reminded Elena of herself at that age. I brought these for them. Mercy held up the flowers. Mama said flowers help the dead. No, they ain't forgotten. That's kind of you. Elena stood and brushed dirt from her knees. Your mama's right about flowers, about remembering. Mercy knelt and placed the wildflowers between the two headstones, arranging them carefully so both graves were equally adorned. I wrote something too. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. A letter, a promise. What kind of promise? That I'm going to be sheriff when I grow up, but different than Daddy was. Mercy's voice was steady, determined. I'm going to speak up when things are wrong. I'm going to protect people who can't protect themselves. Elena felt something tight in her chest loosen for the first time in 20 years. That's a good promise to make. Will you be here to see if I keep it? Elena looked toward the desert horizon where heat waves shimmered like memories made visible. I got to go now, child. My work here is done. Will I see you again? When you need to. Justice has a long memory. Mercy stood and faced Elena with the directness that children possessed before the world taught them to look away from difficult truths. Are you really human? Elena smiled, the question not surprising her. She'd been asked it before, by other children in other places where justice had come calling. I'm what women become when they stop asking permission to exist. I don't understand. You will, when you're older, when the world tries to tell you to stay quiet and be good and let men handle the important things. Elena reached out and touched Mercy's cheek with gentle fingers. When that happens, remember today. Remember that sometimes the most important thing a woman can do is refuse to be silent. Elena turned and walked toward the crossroads where the main road met the desert path. Behind her, she could hear Mercy's footsteps following for a few yards before stopping. When Elena looked back, the girl was standing between the graves like a guardian, her small figure straight and resolute. Elena, Mercy called out. Thank you. Elena raised her hand in farewell and continued walking. The town grew smaller behind her with each step, until it was just a cluster of buildings shimmering in the desert heat. She carried nothing but a small canvas bag with water and bread, the same way she'd left 20 years ago, but this time she wasn't running from anything. She was walking toward whatever came next. The desert welcomed her back like an old friend. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of buried secrets. This was the silence of infinite space and endless possibility, of wind-carved rocks and stars that burned without judgment. Elena had learned to read this landscape like scripture during her years in the wilderness, finding strength in its harsh beauty. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Elena paused at the top of a ridge and looked back one final time. The town was barely visible now, a distant smudge against the green river valley. Smoke rose from chimneys where families were preparing evening meals. Children were playing in yards where their parents could see them, and justice had finally come home to roost. 20 years of waiting, 20 years of learning to become something strong enough to face down corruption and cowardice. 20 years of carrying her daughter's memory like a flame that refused to be extinguished. But now the debt was paid, the truth was told, and a new generation was ready to stand guard. The wind picked up as darkness fell, carrying Elena's voice back across the miles toward the cemetery where a young girl tended two graves with the solemnity of a seasoned keeper of memories. Some debts take a generation to pay. Some women take a lifetime to come home. Elena Morrison disappeared into the desert night, her work complete, her daughter's memory honored, and her legacy alive in the hands of a child who would grow up knowing that silence was never the answer to injustice. Behind her, in the town cemetery, Mercy Pike finished arranging the wildflowers and read aloud the words carved into the marble headstones, her young voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Baby Morrison Reed and preacher Jonathan Reed, beloved son and father, truth endures. The stars came out one by one above the desert, bearing witness to promises made and debts finally paid.